Hi, and welcome. It's been a while, but I've been kind of itching to give BookTube another go. I'm going to be covering what I finished in summer, which in my brain is classified as June, July, and August. I finished 13 books. Almost all of them are audiobooks, and all of them are from my library. But I do want to give a shout out to libraries that have really stepped up with their digital selections, because physical libraries have been closed, and I'm really excited because physical books have now had the possibility to come back into my rotation, as grab and go is being tested out at my local library, so hopefully I'm going to try that out soon. But without further ado, let's get into the books that I finished in summer of 2020. I'm just going to go in the order that I finished them, starting with June. Now, the first book I finished in June is The Witches Are Coming by Lindy West. I did listen to this as an audiobook narrated by herself. I was surprised in a good way by this book because I don't tend to like conversational narrators in writing styles. I do find that when the author talks to me, it's usually kind of a turn-off. However, listening to this as an audiobook, I do think that helped improve this writing style as an experience for me. I think it helped show her wit and tone that she was going for a lot better than if I was just reading this on a page. I don't think this was a hard listen, and I don't necessarily think I learned anything incredible. However, I had an enjoyable experience with this book. If you are already aware of a lot of modern feminist ideas and arguments, I don't think you're going to pick up anything necessarily new from this. However, if you do like heavily sarcastic conversational writing tones, you might really enjoy this. The second book I listened to on audiobook is I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by McNamara. Now, I also listened to this as an audiobook. This book was published after the author's unfortunate early passing and was pulled together by the narrator and Michelle's husband. So at her time of passing, the Golden State Killer had not been found, which is a fact that fortunately has since changed. I'm going to say this as delicately as possible because it's clear that the chapters that Michelle McNamara wrote feel much more cohesive, but the book does feel unfinished, and there is a difference in tone, clearly, from chapters that Michelle wrote herself and the chapters pulled together from her notes and previous writing on the Golden State Killer. This book also is part of the ones that made me realize I am not the target audience for violent true crime. I don't really enjoy hearing about serial killers, and I don't think that my opinion of the book should sway people who like true crime and reading about serial killers. I do think that the book is an interesting look at the way law enforcement tracks or cannot track and has changed in their methods of tracking. I found those parts of the book very interesting. If true crime is your thing, you might want to give this one a go. This one for me was 2.5 stars, just because I don't think that this is a genre I personally am that into. The third book I finished is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. Oh, this is Gerald. I read this as an ebook, so I actually finished a book, and a long one, so I'm kind of proud of that. However, I wanted to like this book, and I did at the beginning. Two big things. First, this book is too long. Not much to say about this point since some parts dragged and could be cut. Pretty self-explanatory. Second, the entire second half of the book. In the beginning, I think that seeing the mother through our main character's eyes was really heartwarming. I connected to Christopher in some ways, and I enjoyed that in a way that I don't usually to children in books. Now, I loved the non-horror aspects of the beginning and was sucked in by that setup when it came to the creeping horror tone. It's why I kind of think I give horror a little bit of leeway when it comes to the slow dragging bits, because I expect payoff. But second part of the book, I hate being preached to. Now, I feel that the second half of the book came off, and if this is spoilers, I'm sorry, but the entire second half came off as Christian propaganda. I grew up the daughter of a preacher and have, since becoming an adult, left the church. Who the imaginary friend ends up being, and the conclusion to how the whole thing is wrapped up, left such a bad taste in my mouth. After attaching to Christopher, this intensified the bitterness at the whole thing. I can't recommend this book unless overt preachiness doesn't bother you. I haven't seen this part of the book really talked about that much, although maybe I'm just reading the wrong reviews. And I don't tend to look at a ton of reviews before going into a book. So maybe that part is just me, and it took me by surprise, and I hated it. Absolutely hated the ending. Ruined the whole book for me. 1.5 stars. So disappointing. But I have to give a little credit to the relationship between Christopher and his mom. That was the highlight for me. I can't recommend this book because, well, I just explained myself. Now, that's everything I finished in June. Moving on to July. The first book that I finished, I listened to as an audiobook, and that's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, by Michelle Alexander. Now, I did listen to the 10th anniversary edition of this as an audiobook. There's a great introduction in the 10th anniversary that gives kind of an update on how little and how much things have changed since the original publication. This book does cover current issues in the criminal justice system, current at the time and unfortunately still now, and does walk through all the connections to systemic racism in the United States history that are still perpetrated through the criminal justice system. I cannot imagine making someone go to prison for less than the things I've done, and I can't imagine ruining someone's life over it. I will link Own Voices reviews in the description box, as well as links to supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and petitions regarding justice for victims of police violence, and a reminder to call or write your representation if you live in the United States like I do. If nothing else, vote, not just in this upcoming presidential election, but your local elections as well, where I will also leave a link to register if you haven't already down below. I'm not going to star rate this book. I do think that stuff like this should be mandatory reading, and I don't think that should get a star rating. On to a very different topic. I finished To Be Taught, If Fortunate by Becky Chambers, which I did finish as an ebook. This is a novella, and so I think that made it a lot easier to finish, especially since the last ebook I finished was so long. This follows a group of scientists and their mission in space. I really enjoyed this one. It was great. It was a very casually comfortable read where all the elements are kind of soft. I don't know if that's the best description, but it's very exploratory, natural science focused, and I really enjoyed that. There's nothing forceful about this book. We just exist with these characters as they go about their mission, and even during the higher tension moments, which there are, we are still just existing with them in that tension, and I think that's done really well. Chambers does a really good job of showing, not telling, and that really lends to this experience. It's also one of the few times I think an open ending felt very deliberate and lended itself to the whole story instead of feeling kind of like a cop-out, something that I really do appreciate. 4 stars. I would read this one again. I do highly recommend it, especially to people who want to try science fiction that doesn't require space, tome level time commitment, and those that might not want a very tech-heavy science fiction experience. Definitely recommend this one. The third book that I finished, and I did listen to it on an audiobook, is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. Now, I wanted to like this more than I did, since it's such a cultural staple. At times, I followed really well what Hawking was saying, and then he would go off on a personal hypothesis that I could no longer follow. He is smart, no doubt, as some of his hypotheses laid out in this have since kind of come true, and it does show he knew his field quite well, and I think that's very impressive. However, this book is meant to be an introduction to the popular reader of the history of time and physics, quantum physics in that arena, and that was not done well. I don't know if there would be enough in here to keep the attention of someone actually in the field on the opposite end of the spectrum. Because it's meant to be introductory, he does end up going back to fairly basic physics and understanding at the time that it was written, and so I don't know if someone who is well versed in the field would want to read this outside of reading books written by Stephen Hawking. Sadly, 2.5 stars, not terrible, but also not what I wanted, a bit below average for what I had expected. I am on the hunt for a better book on the topic, since I think that would be really interesting. The fourth and last thing that I read in July was The Moment of Lift, How Empowering Women Changes the World by Melinda Gates, which I did read as an ebook. I don't know why this book was written. I think that it would have been better if it had less personal information. It should have been, in my opinion, statistical data providing a framework for her argument, with the anecdotal spotlight stories that she did have in the book providing the meat and humanizing element. Every time she talked about herself, I tuned out. She came so many times to writing points I want her to make, but didn't quite get there. So, for example, she talks about how there isn't money to be made in the work her nonprofit does, but doesn't go the step further to recognize that this same system also gave her the resources to run her nonprofit in the first place. And she also says, I don't want to talk too much about myself since I have privilege, but then goes on to talk about herself in a way that feels like it's saying, look, I'm just like you. I think that Melinda Gates is intelligent and impressive, and I would much rather there be billionaires like her and her husband. She gets so close, and she talks very briefly about being overwhelmed because she wants to do the absolute right thing with the amount of power she has, but can't quite get herself over the line to say that this is why the system should change. And changing the system that gave her this kind of money and influence would bring more empowerment to women than just one person on their own running a nonprofit campaign, even if that person is incredibly talented and generous. Somewhere between 2 and 2.5 stars. The writing isn't bad, and I don't think that the Gates are a bad couple. I do think that there's an audience for this book, especially since most people seem to find it inspiring when looking at the good reviews. I just don't think that the audience includes me, and part of that is down to my personal economic views. And if your personal economic views are different, you might find this a much more accessible book in terms of liking it. Now, we finally bring ourselves to August, and the month that just finished. Now, the first book that I listened to in August was Permanent Record by Edward Snowden. I did listen to this narrated by himself. This is Snowden's account of who he is and why he was a whistleblower. I don't think he himself is that interesting of a person, which is what makes this book intriguing to me. Snowden is just some dude who was good with computers and worked for the government, but despite the fact that he's just some dude, he gave his life up here so the American people could make the decision for themselves what to do with their data. Now, the book itself is okay. The writing is okay, the pacing is okay. He spends a lot of time talking about his personal history and brushes past a couple things that I wish he had given more time to include, like private companies gathering similar amounts and types of data, and the culture of people who are paid to pry into our lives. Mostly this is Snowden clearing his name to the American people, and in that he accomplishes his goal, if it's not what I personally would have wanted from the book as a whole. 3 stars is perfectly acceptable, and I think that, like I said, he did what he set out to do in the book. There are probably better books out there if you are looking for a book to learn more about the tracking and storage of data and more technical aspects of the things that Snowden uncovered. I do think if you're interested in Snowden himself, it's an okay read and acts as a primer to learn more. The second book that I finished in August is The Devil in the White City, Murder, Magic, and the Fair That Changed America by Erik, Larson. Now, I listened to this as an audiobook. I was excited to read this book because I had liked Dead Wake, and this is one of Larson's most popular books, if not his most popular book. I had wished he had written 2 separate books, and this does seem to be a common complaint. I don't really care about the Holmes sections, which actually, looking through the low-rated reviews, is kind of opposite. Most people wish that he hadn't focused as much on the building of the city, but as previously stated, I'm not that into books about serial killers, and I really was fascinated by the World's Fair section. I want to look more into the Ferris wheel and the landscaper, who we learn also landscaped Central Park and the politics of getting the fair running and accounts of people who attended the fair. Basically, the fair is cool, but there's no real connection between the two. Larson does the thing where the serial killers are described as being smart and charismatic and makes them seem like they could be cool, and that gives me a gross taste in my mouth, and I really don't like. I will say, McNamara did not do that when talking about the Golden Gate Killer, and I really did appreciate that. I really didn't like this book. It felt too disjointed, and the Holmes bits drag it down a lot. I will read more of his books because, like I said, I liked Dead Wake, and I'm not 100% certain on my opinion of Larson as a whole. However, this particular one was not for me. The next book that I listened to is Black Klansmann, Race, Hate, and the Undercover Investigation of a Lifetime by Ron Stalworth. Now, I did listen to this as an audiobook, and it was read by the author himself. So I picked this up because I had seen in passing a trailer for the movie, and for some reason, when I saw the trailer, I thought that it was comedic fiction. I think I was wrong. So when I saw this in my non-fiction section, I was instantly more interested. Good story, okay writing. Unfortunately, the experience was improved as an audiobook because it comes off much more like an old cop regaling you with tales of his time on the force than I think it would as a physical book. This isn't like a police action story. The importance really comes off, and he does mention this toward the end, of the number of heinous crimes that were never committed in the first place, which in my mind is the purpose of law enforcement, of police mostly in general, at least should be. Their job should be crime prevention and not just reactionary. I do think that investigations like this are incredibly important so that people never experience that kind of hate in their life. I did rate this 3.5 stars, a little higher than average, just because I think the experience of it as an audiobook was really good. In comparison, I am looking forward to watching the movie now because I am curious to see what they can do with this story to make it a bit more engaging, and I might do, if I do watch it in a timely manner, I'm thinking about doing a comparison. I don't know. We'll see. I will also link some Own Voices reviews for this book down below as well. The next book that I finished, also as an audiobook, was The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. And I first heard about this book from a book Olive, whose channel I will link down below. And while I'm not into reading about serial killer and violent true crime, the idea about reading a book about non-violent crime and robbery of weird items seems much more up my alley. And this book was less about the heist than I anticipated and much more about the culture surrounding fly fish tying and the history of fly fish tying. While this book was not what I expected, I still enjoyed this book, although not as much as I had hoped. The author does briefly and tangentially talk about obsession and the way that it ties into the way that members of the fly fish tying community and himself kind of interact with this subject. And I had hoped, once he got into that and realized that this would be less about the heist, that he had gone further into this idea and really explored obsessiveness a bit more, especially as he goes on his own slightly obsessive adventure and goes into that. Now, I do think that this book was good. I had a good time with this book. I do recommend it to others who are interested in nonviolent true crime, but it isn't a new love or favorite, unfortunately, so this book got 3 stars from me. The next book that I read as an ebook, actually finished another one, is called Losing Earth, A Recent History by Nathaniel, which this entire book, the tone is, it's like a giant shrug, which I think is the point. I liked this book. I think that the narrative tone that the author took, like he is telling a story of how this all happened, or, well, didn't happen, is a good way to portray it, because the reason that the entire book feels like a shrug is because that is what everybody in power has basically done about the issue, is just shrug. So I think that the tone is very intentional, and in that way I very much like it, because it shows how we got to where we are in a realistic way. The history that he covers mostly focuses in the beginnings of the movement, sort of 50s to 90s, than in the last 20 years, because it really shows how far back that all of these things have gone, and really how long people in power have been aware of these issues and have been doing nothing. Literally nothing. So I would recommend this book. I would probably say 3.5 stars, 3 to 3.5 stars. It's fine. I do think that it does a good job of capturing the tone. However, I don't necessarily think that it sways the reader necessarily in any direction to do anything. And since I personally feel that should be the point of books about climate change, I can't really rank this book higher of a star rating, since it doesn't really feel like it pressures the reader to do something. The last book that I listened to was The Nocturnal Brain, Nightmares, Neuroscience, and the Secret World of Sleep by Guy Leschnizer. I'm sorry, I did listen to this as an audiobook, and it is narrated by the author himself. This book was fantastic. I really, really liked this book. I think that not only is the topic of sleep really fascinating, and he does go into some of the newer research that's coming out on sleep, which is in itself fascinating, but he also manages to talk about invisible illnesses and the way that chronic illnesses can impact your interaction with the world, and the way that everybody expresses a lot of these things very differently. My mom has a number of the issues that he talks about, and hearing about experiences that I've watched my mom go through on a daily basis was really nice, and I think that he does it in a compassionate way. And I think that if you don't know someone in your life affected by an invisible illness, and you also think that sleep is fascinating, I highly recommend this book, because he does both. He both keeps you interested in the science and also manages to talk about the struggles of some of these issues in an incredibly compassionate way. 4.5 stars. I thought this was fantastic, and I am thinking about revisiting it again, even though I'm not really much of a rereader, so that says something. That was everything I listened to in the summer months, and then the couple of books that I actually read physically. Well, on ebook. But loving audiobooks this year. I think they've been a fantastic inclusion into my repertoire. I really haven't gotten into them until this year, but can say, without a doubt, I think they are fantastic, and 100% recommend them to people who might be in a reading slump to help get over said slump. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!